Welcome, everybody. My name's Hannah Albertus Benham. I'm civil engineer. I work for WSP as a water resources and environmental engineer, and been a member of ASCE for a long time now, over 20 years. I'm the current chair of the Minnesota Report Card Committee, and we had the report card released earlier this year, which is done every 4 years in collaboration between the Minnesota and Duluth sections of ASCE. And it examines our state's current infrastructure across various categories, and then provides advice on ways to improve infrastructure, and then as well as educating stakeholders. And you can find an overview and introduction video on our website, the ascemn.org/report card, as well as a link to the full report and brochure. And these chapter spotlights are to help us fulfill the mission of the report card, which is to, again, educate stakeholders and support infrastructure advocacy efforts. So we hope that these help you all become familiar with each of the chapters of the report card so you can engage on these topics more confidently with the public and decision makers. So we have a short presentation today and some time for feedback and questions. And with that, I will turn it over to Lisa, who was our Stormwater chapter lead. And you'll have to share your screen again, Lisa. Sorry.
Oh, did we lose that? All right.
Yeah, sorry about that.
No worries. Okay, thanks, Hannah. I'm Lisa Brew. I'm a professional engineer in the Surface Water and Sewers Division of Minneapolis Public Works, and I led the Stormwater chapter for this year's report card. I was lucky to have a great team help me out with this chapter. Everybody had specific skill sets and knowledge that helped shape each section. And we're really excited to get stormwater included for the very first time in our Minnesota infrastructure report card. I will take us through some of our intro information, funding, and hold on, we skipped ahead here. Funding and future need. Riley's going to cover condition, operation, and maintenance. Kate is going to cover capacity, safety, and resilience, and Eric is going to take us through innovation. Because we're new, we're not simply looking at our performance last report card and seeing where we have improved or where we've slipped. We looked at the categories laid out in the National Report Card Framework and boiled them down into key indicators that we could rank in a rubric. The success measured by each of those indicators earned us points, which we could translate into a letter grade. Minnesota has some very high-ranking categories like funding and innovation, and some places where we need improvement like public safety and future need. Overall, we've scored in the C range. This is better than the nation as a whole, which received a D. It is hard to compare to other states where much of their large drainage infrastructure is still managed by combined sewer systems and under consent decrees, or dry states where drainage is often mostly limited to flood infrastructure. It's also difficult because here stormwater can be wrapped into road and other capital improvement projects. And so it can take some digging to pull info about just storm infrastructure needs and costs. Probably the most similar state that also has a stormwater category would be Wisconsin. They also ranked at a C, but with some different reasoning. This document, the infrastructure report card, is written for the public and especially legislators, many of whom don't really have background in infrastructure in general. We have to define a lot of the terminology and acronyms that we use every day. Even as practitioners, we had to set boundaries of what stormwater means, what we are actually grading, and that took some discussion. We do need to represent the whole state, but also we rely on public data and are not so much analyzing data, but aggregating it. We are not delving into private infrastructure. We did decide that BMPs and green infrastructure are an important part of our stormwater systems, and it is increasingly difficult to separate out treatment from conveyance under our MS4 permit. So we've decided to look at data on both. And we're also staying focused on the infrastructure. We're not necessarily looking at the benefits of that infrastructure or the water resources that it is there to protect. In our quest to represent the whole state and the diverse owners of public stormwater infrastructure, we sent out a survey to various umbrella organizations and professional societies to try and reach state, city, county, and watershed officials. We did get a few responses in each of those ownership categories, which is not bad, but we can do better. And that's partly why we're making some of these presentations to get the word out and get more data. Responses were pretty much all over the place, averaging out to mediocre, which is a C grade. We also had to rely heavily on publicly available data to supplement sort of this feeling from these different owners. And we also wanted to find more facts and figures that would resound with the public. Now that we have a baseline and can focus more on updates in future years, we'll also probably do more interviewing and follow up with those survey respondents. If you responded this year, thank you very, very much. For funding and future need, we're seeing a lot of growth in the number of stormwater utilities. And here, a stormwater utility is more of a fee structure than a utility organization. And so municipalities are setting up more and more stormwater utilities to cover growing gaps in maintenance and reporting for MS4 permitting. We are lucky in Minnesota to have numerous alternative funding sources. We can reach out to federal, state, and local levels for funding. And luckily for us, some of those priorities do change to match needs that our agencies are seeing in the stormwater world. We're also getting a lot of good information from the resilience planning and implementation grants that are helping municipalities identify and quantify their needs as we move forward into the future. The number of applicants for getting onto the state project priority list far exceeds the need. The need far exceeds what we are able to fund. We had 315 submitted projects for the last handful of PPLs. 29 projects were funded at a cost of $185 million, while we've identified a $3.4 billion need. Pass it off to Riley.
Hey everyone, my name is Riley. I work as an engineering manager for a local pipe and stormwater products manufacturer. And I was in charge of writing and developing our condition and operation and maintenance sections for the report card. When we look at this, really the most important part of evaluating the condition as well as the maintenance of stormwater systems is having a foundational, functional asset management system. Those asset management tools will allow us to have an accurate picture of the inventory and condition of the drainage systems. It allows us to proactively respond to assets that are maybe near failure to limit emergency replacements or catastrophic collapses. Many municipalities have implemented drainage utilities or included drainage utilities as part of their asset management programs. But the single largest and most comprehensive, and certainly it helps that it's publicly available database is MnDOT's TAMS and HYDRA program. Here they have summarized available condition and inspection information that they've collected for the past decade or more. Anyone can look these up on their site. It is not the full picture for stormwater statewide, but it does give us a very good sense of where we're sitting, where things stand across the state. I think it's very indicative of probably where a lot of places are at. So as you can see in the figure on the left, there's a good trend in monitoring and inspecting culverts and stormwater assets. Where last year they were at, you can't really see it, it's somewhat hidden, but 96% is what they hit for their targets of inspecting culverts on a regular basis. If you're familiar with that HYDRA system, they have an assignment for inspection frequency based on the condition of that culvert. So they're at 96% of that goal. And you see in the figure on the right that as we grow in a better understanding of what our assets are and what their conditions are, And we're uncovering as the years go on that we have a bigger and growing need for new and updated infrastructure. You'll see, and over the past decade, obviously the condition has gotten increasingly worse, where we have last year now up to 24% of our stormwater infrastructure managed by the state of Minnesota is in poor or severe condition. So when it comes to how this all contributed to the report card, there's a number of different factors that we threw in for our scoring rubric in regards to these topics. The first being that over the past decade, we have seen a very positive trend in the number of agencies and municipalities that have included stormwater infrastructure in their asset management programs. And along with that, we've seen the emergence of some very helpful tools and sharing of best practices for those inspections and ratings of stormwater assets. MnDOT, I believe, is leading the charge with this. A lot of their TAMs and hydro database tools and manuals that are, I believe, very helpful for a number of agencies. And then having those tools in place has allowed agencies to proactively address those condition concerns and then make replacements before there are detrimental results to our public. And then lastly, which I think is a big part of all of this, not just condition and operation and maintenance, but as we develop that better understanding of the condition of our assets, and we realize that there's a growing gap between the available funds and the needed funds to continue to not only grow our infrastructure as we have increases in developments, but it also makes it difficult for agencies to keep up with the required maintenance and operations for their now aging stormwater systems. And I'll turn it over to Kate.
Hi, I'm Kate. I'm a water resources engineer with Houston Engineering, and I'll be covering capacity, safety, and resilience. So when it comes to stormwater infrastructure, communities across Minnesota are at very different stages of development, which made it difficult to assign a single representative grade. Some communities have detailed hydraulic and hydrologic models that help them understand system performance, while others have limited modeling or are relying on older data and assumptions. Because the availability of resources, funding, and data varies widely across the state, there is uncertainty about how well existing infrastructure can handle current and future storm events, which makes it difficult to assess statewide preparedness. At the same time, Minnesota is experiencing wetter conditions. The 10 wettest years on record have all occurred since 1998, and annual precipitation has increased by 3.4 inches since 1895. As rainfall becomes more frequent and more intense, having accurate and up-to-date stormwater models is increasingly important for identifying infrastructure vulnerabilities and planning improvements. In communities where modeling has been completed, tools such as flood mapping can help pinpoint undersized storm sewers, identifies areas that are at risk of flooding, and evaluate how projected precipitation trends can affect future system performance. Many communities may not have the resources they need to fully assess their flood risk, which contributed to the assigned grade. And a lot of Minnesota's stormwater infrastructure was developed based on historic conditions. When stormwater infrastructure is stressed beyond its limits, we can see localized flooding, erosion, sinkholes, and slope instability, which can affect transportation networks, utilities, homes, and businesses. Two examples of those impacts are shown on this slide: a sinkhole in St. Paul on the left, and then a slope failure near the University of Minnesota campus on the right. These types of failures highlight the importance of understanding where vulnerabilities exist before they become problems. Communities are increasingly using system evaluations and planning tools to better understand vulnerabilities and guide future improvements. And while these efforts show meaningful progress, the continued occurrence of stormwater-related failures emphasize the need for additional system upgrades across the state, which contributed to the assigned grade. And I'll pass it off to Eric.
Hi, my name is Eric Francis. I'm the Water Resources Manager for St. Louis Park, and I was in charge of the innovation section of the Stormwater chapter. Minnesota's variable climate, characterized by fluctuating precipitation, snowmelt, and extensive freeze-thaw cycles, place mounting pressure on our water resources, underscoring the need for innovative policies and practice to safeguard them. Organizations like the Minnesota Stormwater Research Council and the St. Anthony Falls Laboratory develop new technologies to mitigate stormwater's runoff impact on our environment. While the Watershed Restoration Project protection strategies, local cities, counties, states, and watershed districts put these technologies into practice on both a local and watershed scale to strengthen the resiliency across the state. Funding sources such as the Clean Water Land and Legacy Amendment provide critical support for funding projects and research, while collaborative efforts such as the University of Minnesota Stormwater Seminar Series and the Minnesota City Stormwater Coalition help drive innovation. However, ongoing funding support is essential to stay ahead of our changing climate and our aging infrastructure. That's it. Back to you, Lisa.
All right, so what do we do about all of this? Another important part of the infrastructure report card is not just to take stock in where we're at, but to also make solutions to raise the grade and hopefully get us to do better than a C in the future. In Minnesota, we're sometimes missing the long-term plan for paying for maintenance. As we adapt and innovate, it's important to make sure that the funding of capital projects doesn't lead to something that's unmaintainable and storm infrastructure where the life cycle and maintenance is not thought about in terms of the larger projects. And so we need to make sure that the industry and policymakers are both aligned on funding priorities and that we have grants and sustainable funding sources that we can use to make sure that we are maintaining our infrastructure. It would also help us to kind of enforce, not just establish and fund, but also make sure that owners of infrastructure are on top of their regular maintenance programs. Long-term needs should also be identified at the time of implementing some of these larger capital projects to make sure that asset management can occur in an efficient manner. It would also really help if we had a comprehensive needs assessment. There are a lot of places where being part of a combined sewer system allows for those wastewater and stormwater operators to kind of do some time saving and respond to surveys collaboratively. And we don't have as much data as some of those surveys go to wastewater operators, and our stormwater folks never see them. It would be great to have a comprehensive needs assessment where we can reach out to all of these different owners and align on what our funding priorities are. These are some things that we already do quite well, but we need to not forget that, and we need to make sure that we continue working on that. We are working on simplifying and streamlining a lot of our rules and design standards, but we should also make sure that we continue to allow for flexibility, adaptation, and innovation, mostly because we are also adapting to changing conditions. We are including updated forecasts and adapting standards and codes to reflect changes in our climate data, but we should also make sure that we are shifting targets for water quality and flood control as needed to make sure that our systems are serving our state and our water resources. We should continue collaborating to streamline decision-making, definitely accepting sub-watershed approaches and having agencies and municipalities work together can increase our efficiency. And then part of why we're doing this and something we all need to continue to do together is to educate our communities about the cost involved, but also the savings and reduced hazards and other ecosystem benefits that we get from taking care of our stormwater management systems. We're all volunteers. We have various experience levels. Anybody could do this. And you know, there's space for all sorts of people with varying interests to get involved. So if that's something you'd like to do, we'll definitely be looking for people to join us when we come back again in 4 years. Also, if you know you're part of an agency or an organization that is creating a study, is distilling some of this data, it's always great to get more data to represent all of the infrastructure owners in our state. So now we'll have some time for questions. We will also be at the Minnesota Water Resources Conference. We have both a poster presentation and an oral presentation. And definitely, if you have time to come swing by our poster, if you want to talk about some of the data, if you want to talk about what you're seeing as an infrastructure owner or as a representative, please stop by and talk to us about that. And then if you have interest in, presenting a project or something throughout the year, I can also be reached at this ASCE Environmental and Water Resources email down here for our Environmental and Water Resources group.
Great. Yes, please reach out to us if you have further thoughts or ideas. We do have one question in the chat so far. So Brian asks, how well do you think this chapter and the report card in general represents the infrastructure for cities under population of 5,000? If you want to take a stab at it, and I can answer more generally.
So I do think, again, that's one of the hard things about representing the whole state is if we sent out our survey and we targeted only cities under 5,000, I think we would still kind of get a lot of different responses across the board. And that kind of depends on how the city is run and how the budgeting is done. And especially for these smaller cities, that can be done in a number of different ways. And I think it also depends, are there other water resources in that community? And definitely, even with some of the larger cities and setting up these stormwater utilities to cover gaps in funding, there's also sort of this struggle of like, well, we might have like a rural portion of the city and we might have a more developed portion of the city. And how do we write this fee ordinance and come up with this fee structure that isn't treating an agricultural parcel like a developed or a residential parcel. And so the makeup of that city probably also heavily influences how they're feeling about their infrastructure and whether they're able to maintain it. So I think, that's one of the things that we just really wanted to make clear in our first iteration of the report card is that there's a lot going on, and there are a lot of differing opinions. And so a C grade seems fair for just the amount of variety we have in the state.
Yeah, and more generally, I guess for the rest of the report card, I think stormwater is a little unique in that it really is dependent on the features in each community. Some have larger challenges than others. There's other chapters like when you get into more of the transportation side, transit systems and things like that, that's more dependent on location. So communities farther out from the metro areas are struggling more with transit, for instance, than communities closer. And so each chapter is a little bit different in that way when it comes to smaller communities. And it just kind of depends on the different category of infrastructure that you're talking about. So I would say generally with the report card, it's a difficult kind of line to toe when we're grading because a lot of times there's infrastructure, a lot of the funding is focused on the metro area or areas. And then the farther out you get, the more difficult it becomes, and you're relying more heavily on getting direct appropriations rather than some of that general fund or other funding sources. So there it's a balance. So we have to kind of take into consideration the great things and the great funding that's available in the metro areas and things that are going on there. And then maybe, you would give a lower grade to the outstate areas because there's not as much funding or, conditions are worse or whatever the case is there. So that's reflected in the grade in that way, that there's that balance where if you were looking at just the metro area, maybe you'd give something a B grade or an A grade, but then you have to take the whole state into consideration, and that can tend to skew the grades just overall. So another question came in from Nick. Does the ASCE look at how stormwater may impact other assets like roads, bridges, and possibly affect their grades? Can you speak to that at all?
I do think, if someone was looking at the roads category and they are looking at, the condition, operations and maintenance, that definitely the stormwater could have an impact on the safety items that they're seeing, the pavement condition. I think a lot of that probably gets baked into there. We're not necessarily looking at that other infrastructure, but we do have the safety and the resilience category. And so we are looking at, those things that pop up in the news where there's some sort of failure. And so it is impacting our grade as well. I think there's so much that's also baked into the roads and bridges, and we have dams, and there's other infrastructure that also has some overlap with stormwater. That it may not be immediately clear how much stormwater might have an impact on one of those, but I think if we got really good at some of our asset preservation and some of those other categories, but we're lacking in stormwater, it would be apparent that that was the reason why.
Yeah, I don't know if anybody else wants to jump in, but I was just looking too. There's definitely overlap when it comes to talking about resilience, because there's been some resilience funding that's come through that's supported bridges and roadways to, kind of look at culverts that are in need of repair or can be upgraded to be better able to withstand future storm events. And so there's definitely overlap there. You'll see discussion of culverts, for instance, in both of those chapters of the report card. And then he asked a follow-up, does drought management come into play for scores in other states?
I'm not so sure if drought management comes into play, but definitely probably handling the opposite and some of those other extreme events. I think that's one of the things that's very difficult about stormwater and like coming up with a grade, because we also want it to be relative to these other states in the nation. But we definitely have different things that are going on and different priorities. I'm not sure that, there are very many of these dry states that have taken the time to include stormwater into their report card. And so that might be something that we see more in the future. And if they determine it's a priority, they may touch on that. I do know like the national report card, and this might not so much be in the stormwater section, but maybe more in dams. There is discussion of some more climate related things that might touch into that.
And I imagine drinking water as well, that's more discussed in those drier states in those chapters. We are at time. I don't see any other questions coming through. So I think that we'll wrap here, but thank you all. Thank you to Lisa, Eric, Riley, and Kate for presenting today. And thanks everyone for joining us. There will be a recording of this online, so you can access it later, and look out for additional emails for future chapter spotlights. I think you had a slide on the future ones. I don't know if you want to show that quick, but otherwise we'll let everyone go.
Go.
There it is. Yeah. So next one will be drinking water in October on the 20th, and then bridges in November, and then we'll get a future ones out shortly as well. So thank you all for joining us. Have a great rest of your day.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.